Hey everyone, this is Tim Chavez from Faith Matters. In this episode, we speak with Joanna Brooks, author of the new book Mormonism and White Supremacy. Joanna holds a Ph.D. in English from UCLA. She's the Associate Vice President for Faculty Advancement at San Diego State University and has written or edited 10 books on race, religion, gender, social movements, and American culture. As we all continue to grapple with issues of race, not just in America, but in our own faith, we thought it was important to understand how we got where we are. Joanna helps us explore the history of the church as it relates to race. She illustrates where we could and should have done better, in addition to telling the stories of heroes who stood up against racism, even at great personal cost. We're really grateful to Joanna for coming on the podcast and for her willingness to share what she's learned over many years of research. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
All right, Joanna Brooks, we are so excited to have you on the Faith Matters podcast. Thank you so much for making some time to talk with us this morning.
Of course. Thank you for reaching out.
So your new book, Mormonism and White Supremacy, American Religion and the Problem with Racial Innocence, just came out. And it was days after George Floyd's murder that this conversation really ignited. And your book is sitting there and ready to buy and to read and figure out the part that we play as members of the church. But I wanted to ask you about the title. I devoured this book. I really could not put it down. And I took it everywhere I went. And a couple of times people asked me what I was reading, and I realized I was really embarrassed to say Mormonism and White Supremacy.
I know.
I feel like they're words that make you think of, sheets and skinheads, and it's everything I want to disassociate myself with. So
I know.
Maybe we can start with defining white supremacy and why that for the title.
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Aubrey. So it took me, it was a few years ago before I started realizing that the term white supremacy was the accurate scholarly term, right? I mean, so some of my training is in the field of ethnic studies, religious studies, American studies. So, I had always said white privilege or racism, but scholars in my field started saying, no, white supremacy, it's not just the people carrying tiki torches at Charlottesville. It's not just the skinheads. It's a whole system. It's a whole system of laws, beliefs, practices, policies that eventuate in an outcome of Black lives being valued less than white lives, of Black people, just by virtue of being born with melanated skin, having higher rates of incarceration, earlier deaths, more health problems, less intergenerational family wealth, just by the virtue of being born with a certain skin color. And that's a tough pill to swallow, that these systems we live that afford us white privilege, that afford us this form of immunity and even benefit, unearned advantage, are actually about the systematic privileging, the supering, right, of white over Black, and that's white supremacy. And so I know it's a jarring title. I wanted to use that term out of respect for all the scholars who come before me who have said, no, this is what it is. And I also wanted to use it to really increase the stakes and add a sense of moral seriousness, and to recognize that when we're talking about white supremacy, it's not something we can say, oh, those guys over there, those ignorant people over there, we're not like that. It's like, I wish that were true. I wish that were true. They're an extreme example, an almost cartoonishly extreme example of realities we live in, and if you identify as white, benefit from every day.
Yep, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I wondered too, at the beginning, it seemed like in the first couple of chapters of the book, there were several terms that needed redefining based on how we consistently understand them. I mean, white supremacy among them, racism, race, even innocence, sin, all of these things. I think if you take sort of the superficial definition, then the conversation may not bear as much fruit. But if you can redefine them in a particular way, as you do in the book, then it really helps the process of introspection a little bit along. The term racism especially, can be very, it can feel very accusatory, right?
Right. And no one wants to be a racist.
Yes.
No one wants to be called a racist, right?
Exactly. And so I would love to, I think, go through some of those terms and use
Yeah.
and talk about your definitions. But in general, the question is too, like, how do we foster a language, given that our goal is to increase, or I guess we have many goals here, but like, obviously Black lives and taking care of them is sort of top of the list, but we also want to increase engagement. We want to increase empathy. And like, how can we foster a language that does that? Is it using these terms that are quite loaded for a lot of people, or, you know?
It's a tough question because, you know, I'm writing in terms that scholars use, and I'm honoring the specific disciplinary language of my field out of respect. How you do that in everyday life, sometimes, you know, translation matters and empathy matters. But let's go back to the core of your question. So, you know, I think actually redefining the terms and the way scholars use it can help people feel less accused. So, for example, racism. You know, I've said it over and over again to my kids. Actually, my kids said it. My daughter Rosa said it to me the other night, and a student of mine said it. Oh, yeah, it's like you said. And this doesn't originate with me. Racism is not a character flaw; it's a system.
Oh,
It's not a character flaw. It's not like you're a bad person because you harbor some deep dark secret.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's you are part of something much bigger than you, unknowingly, maybe sometimes knowingly, that benefits you because of your race. We live in racist systems. They precede us. They're hundreds of years in the making. We're born into them. We're raised up in them by good, loving people. And it takes intentional choice to start opting out of them, right? And those are everyday choices we make. So, you know, I think in that way, you know, telling, you know, popularizing, as you're helping do with this podcast, popularizing the understanding that racism isn't a character flaw. It's a system that allocates life chances based on your race. And the idea that race is not a real thing. Like, this is something that scholars in ethnic studies and in, you know, social sciences in the academy have been talking about for decades. You know, whiteness is a fake idea. None of us are, these categories of racial identification understanding came into being. We can pinpoint the moments in history when they come into being, when these words start being used in the way they're being used now. They haven't existed from the dawn of time this way, right? They became a kind of shorthand in the 17th and 18th centuries where people could go into a really complicated reality and sort it out, right? You imagine you're in Virginia in 1720, you know, and you have people from everywhere flooding into this place, and race became the shorthand through which people could say, you play this role, you play this role, I dominate you, you dominate them, right? So it was a color coding almost to sort out complicated social realities. So, you know, but if you look at it, there's no gene for race. Different people have counted as white over time, right? There was a time in history, in US history, when Irish people were not considered white. You know, there are, you know, Southern Europeans were not considered white until they demonstrated through their actions by opting in and supporting the white majority and discriminating against or differentiating from Black people that they belonged, right? So that's a helpful term as well. I mean, I think one of the gifts of Mormonism is we know our genealogies. A lot of white people don't. So I know my grandfather on my mother's side was Basque. My grandmother on my mother's side was English, and her family crossed the plains, right? I know who I am. A lot of white people have no clue. They have no clue. And so we can see, and we know that we're different, right, as Mormon people. So we have a point of differentiation against the mainstream, like dare to be different. But many white people don't have that space outside of the mainstream where they can say, who am I really? What really matters to me? What should I really do? They're going with the flow of a massive structure, a cultural structure that sort of washes out senses of belonging and responsibility. And so I think, you know, just to return to your original question, Tim, like, how do we have these conversations? How do we translate them? You know, for me, like, the spirit of it that makes sense for me is in a spirit of shared responsibility. You know, like, these are not conversations about who's on the Lord's side, who.
Right.
This is not you're in and you're out. It's like, we have work to do. I feel we have work to do. My understanding has been changed. It's about doing through your actions. It's about showing up where it matters with your money and your body, right? And others will notice and follow. We know that, right? And so you don't have to go home and have the hard conversation, on Sunday at the family after church gathering, if that's not the right place, right? Like, you don't have to throw the book down on the table. I've got something to talk about, there's a quiet, powerful example and a lot of inner work all of us can do. And the more we do that, it will change the community.
I love that. I feel like that was such an important takeaway that I got from the book, just that this is not about me defending the idea that I'm not a racist, and I feel like a lot of the conversation on social media has been around just this defensiveness, like proving that I really don't have these racist feelings inside myself, so I can excuse myself from this conversation because you're not talking to me.
Right.
And I feel like that was such an important message, that this is a system I didn't opt into and that I totally have responsibility for.
That's it. That's exactly. And, and you think about our defensiveness too, as LDS people, right? Because anytime we all know the history of the church on race has been used to humiliate and shame Mormon people. It's also been used to coddle and cultivate us. I mean, somehow it was okay. We were singing at inaugurations, even though we were segregated because, anyway, but LDS people are super protective of our faith and super protective of, defending against the idea that we were wrong. And I think the major corner we all have to turn is that it's okay to be wrong. Like nowhere, you look at the scriptures, the history of God's people is we were wrong and then we were wrong again. Like look at the Old Testament.
Yeah.
God's people were always wrong. And how they got to know God was like, jumped in the middle and said, guys, you messed up again. And they're like, oh yeah. And then they did it wrong again. But why, when did it become okay? When did we feel when did we stop feeling we could be wrong?
Yeah. Right. And I love you sorry, Tim. No, this brings us to racial innocence. This term you bring up, racial innocence. Would you talk about that? And just this sort of a redefinition of what sin is.
Right. Right. So let's start with sin. So in the book, I talk about how, early Christian theology, and, when I say early, I mean like through the 1800s, Calvinism, a lot of the theological well springs from which Joseph Smith drew, had a notion of sin that was much more rich and complicated than the one we teach in primary. And it's and we get a sense of it in some of the higher teachings in Mormonism and some of the, in some of the language about being free from the sins of your generation, right? So we get a sense of it there, but sin was understood by early Protestant theologians as early Christian theologians as just something we were born into as humans. It's a condition, right? I mean, it's that idea of the natural man as enemy to God, right? So we are, as created beings, we operate in a material sphere that is flawed, that is not yet exalted, where there are just mistakes, there are accidents, people are hurt badly, people can lose their lives, laws are broken, and that's the sphere we move in. So sin is the condition that defines us all, and achieving, redemption from sin in early theology was about covenant with a community to look out for the community and do your best and hold each other accountable, and you transact through the redemption of Jesus Christ, right? So that it was a collective understanding. In the 19th century, that gets really rationalized, is what I call it, is individualized and kind of emptied out. So we move to an idea of sin that's less about belonging to a community that struggles than it is about you individually did something wrong. You individually, you put your hand in the cookie, you stole a cookie from the cookie jar, right? You didn't pay your tithing. You killed someone. You coveted your neighbor's spouse, like that individualized notion of sin. And then churches offered a notion of redemption that was, if you come to church in a sort of transactional way, you'll be forgiven of that, right? You show up, pay your tithing or give your offerings every week and be a good citizen and don't say bad words, and you're safe. You're check.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah. So, what the downside of that is that sin is, it evacuates us of a much deeper sense of moral responsibility and culpability. It makes it impossible for us to conceive of everybody's kind of caught up in something wrong. We're all caught up in something wrong, right? And that is the scale of moral imagination we need to understand the extent of racism, right? So sin is the structure and condition of humankind. Racism is the structure and condition of human life in the US in the 20th and 21st centuries. It's just the way it is. And it was made that way. It came into being through a set of deliberate choices, millions of them, to privilege white over black, but it's a system, it's a condition. And the only way out is through choosing out, and choosing out in community, choosing out together and trying to establish paces that they're never going to be free from sin, but at least we can be in dialogue and in responsible conversation about what these places need to do better. So there's that. Now, racial innocence is actually a term that comes from legal scholarship, that, basically this notion of sin and innocence, this simple version that started materializing in the 19th century, is transported into legal reasoning. The idea that a white person is not responsible and shouldn't be harmed, quote, quote, in any way by legislative or judicial actions to end segregation or end structural inequality, right? So we see it in the 1950s and the 1980s around U.S. Supreme Court decisions around desegregation of schools, around affirmative action, where they say, oh no, we can't apply this remedy because it would hurt this white person and they're innocent. They didn't hurt anyone. So it's what we hear, like, for example, we say, well, my grandfather didn't, my family didn't own slaves. I never did anything wrong. Correct. You individually, your ancestors individually may not have committed overt racist acts to your knowledge, but does that mean we shouldn't be responsible for these vast systems that have given us unearned advantages? Right. And racial innocence is that individual plea, like, but I'm not racist, like you said, Aubrey.
Yeah. So in the way I sort of sometimes see this individualized notion of sin is that once you have sinned, you go through this process of like feeling guilty and then, making some sort of recompense. And I think a lot of people, maybe would be, if you then broaden the idea of sin to make it more collective, they'd be more okay with the idea of like making some sort of recompense. Yeah. And maybe I don't want to necessarily project here, but like, I think there's a hang up though. Like, I don't want to feel guilty about this because again, it's just like that embedded notion of individuality. And so like, is guilt a part of the process when you're talking about collective sin and redemption?
Ooh, well, so let's just make it real. Let's just bring that conversation right here. So how did you feel when you read the book? And because I'm pretty direct about a lot of the mistakes Mormon people have made. Did it hurt?
Yeah.
Yes.
It hurt me to write it. It was painful. It wasn't yay. It wasn't joyful. Like I found another instance. It was like, oh, crud. Really? We quoted from Confederate history and B.H. Roberts' course on the 70s. That was our footnote. It was gut punch, not fun. Now, that's sorrow. That's the kind of humbling that we have to do, right? And so, is that what guilt is? Maybe. But there's no way through this without a humbling. If we could imagine, Cornel West, Dr. Cornel West said years ago that if white people could taste just a tiny bit of the sorrow Black people carry, it would be astonishing. Mm-hmm. And so how do we be in a community if we're not willing to sit with sorrow and sit with discomfort and sit with things that make us sick enough that say, I can't, not one more day of this. I can't. I will not raise my children in a world where Black men are killed on the street under the boot heels of police officers. That's no longer acceptable. I'm sick about it, right? That's the kind of sorrow that leads to good things, I believe.
Yeah. I think it was, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was the James Baldwin quote that was about being trapped in history. Something like, you're trapped in history you don't understand, and until you understand it, you can't be released from it.
Yep.
I loved that, because that was what I felt. That's where I felt called. I felt like I need to understand where I fit into this story, especially as a Mormon woman. You know, I know that race is complicated. I think most members are, they like to champion this idea that Joseph Smith ordained Elijah Abel, and we all know that, and then it gets really fuzzy after that, and we're not really sure what happened.
And then needle scratch, like,
yes, exactly. Yeah, and I love the history of our church. I feel like I've got like a fairly acceptable foundation, and I had never heard these stories. It just, every chapter blew my mind. And
these stories,
the Abraham Smoot and Zebedee Coltrane, like, what? I know. I had no idea how we got from Joseph to Brigham. You know, I didn't understand that leap. So I feel like you've got to tell that story. Would you just talk about those two men? And
oh, for sure, I will. But you know, we both need to give credit. So, like, you know, I didn't know these stories either, but there were people who knew these stories before our time, right? Like, Black LDS people have known these stories, and they've just been too polite to tell us, or we've been too obnoxious and not listened and not really thought and not really been in a place to hear. I mean, why should they spend all their effort? They're just trying to go to Sunday and get a moment's rest. Like, why should they spend Sunday educating us? This stuff has been some of this stuff has been in dialogue. It's been in books by people like Paul Reeve, by Newell Bringhurst and Matt Harris. So it's there. I think it's just what I offered as a synthesis kind of from end to end. So, you know, yes, Joseph Smith ordained Black people. Was he a firmly committed soldier for Black freedom? No, he was kind of all over the place, because that's who Joseph Smith was. He was just a big personality. And then Brigham, you know, torch is passed to Brigham, and he comes west, and, you know, his goal is to establish a territorial theocracy. He wants to establish an empire, and he's pretty clear that religion and territory conjoin in government and priesthood government, and that is a government in which, in his words, white men will rule over all others and over Black men, right? And he establishes, you know, through the legislature, territorial legislature, pro-slavery policies, anti-Black voting, anti-Black holding elected office policies, not to get a big captive labor force in Utah, but to keep Black people out of Utah. Black people were coming west at that time. They were going to California in large numbers from the gold rush on, you know, and Utah's population stayed very low because it was a slave state. It was a slave state. We were a slave state. So after that point, we see, after Brigham Young's death, some of the people who are the guardians of this territorial theocracy made really conscious choices to maintain the story that Elijah Abel's ordination was illegitimate and should not be honored, that it was a mistake or a one-off or a concession. And so this is the story I tell in the book of Abraham Smoot, who had been, you know, born and raised in Kentucky, had gone on a mission in Alabama, was a Southerner, and came west, but, you know, told Brigham Young pretty much he wanted to maintain his slaves when he came. And, you know, it was the influence of people like Smoot who helped motivate Young to make sure the territory was a pro-slavery space. So Smoot gets here, you know, he moves down to Provo. He kind of becomes like stake president and mayor and the first trustee of Brigham Young University. He's a really successful businessman. In 1879, after state conference one day, John Taylor comes down to visit state conference, and afterwards goes back to one of Smoot's 4 houses in Provo, and Smoot and asks Smoot to recollect for him the story of the ordination of Elijah Abel, because Abraham Smoot had been ordained at the same time, on the same day, in the same place as Elijah Abel. And the man who ordained him and Elijah Abel was a man named Zebedee Coltrane, who by that point was sort of a poor farmer, like barely scraping by on the outskirts of Spanish Fork. And Smoot, in fact, was owned the land that Coltrane lived on via the United Order, right? Oh. No pressure on Coltrane, right? So Abraham Smoot brings Coltrane in, and Coltrane says, yeah, I ordained him, but it really wasn't supposed to be that way. And Joseph Smith himself said that this shouldn't be. And then Abraham Smoot said, yep, what he said, and I say the same thing, and ordination of Black people should not happen. And they lied. They lied together. they had both been there. They had both seen hands placed on Elijah Abel's head and the priesthood conveyed upon him. Coltrane had done it himself, and yet they arrayed their testimonies against him, and they knew what that meant. Elijah Abel had documents of his ordination that he would carry around to try and show people, and it was always being debated. And this very powerful figure cast his lots decisively against Black testimony, against Black authority, and against Black lives. Like, he held Black people in slavery in Provo.
That's really.
But he's a human, right? But he's a human, and we're not going to hate on Abraham Smoot. It's just like, but we need to be like big caution, like the way we came to power in this territorial theocracy, the way we carved out the space we have, the fact that it is a resolutely white space still, that's not an accident. And if we want that to change, we have to know how we got here.
And just so we're totally clear on like the historical facts too, you're saying that Zebedee Coltrane is the one who actually did the ordination of Elijah Abel.
That's my recollection. I can call it my manuscript. Sometimes the footnotes get fuzzy, but there's a master's thesis at BYU done on the life of Zebedee Coltrane.
Okay.
And there's a footnote in there, and it's on the link for the day I talked about one of the Smoot statues on my Facebook. So I'm happy to share that with you.
Yeah, that'd be great.
If you get the master's thesis from BYU about Zebedee Coltrane, it's in there.
Cool. And then so we're talking then 50 years later, is it 50, 40 years later, something like that, that he and the Zebedee Coltrane and Abraham Smoot say that the reason this was invalid is that Joseph Smith, 40 years, Joseph Smith later said, and it sounded in the book like maybe Joseph Smith hadn't realized that Elijah Abel was Black, and they had at some point recanted. But it sounds like there's no evidence that actually ever occurred, that Joseph Smith had any desire of revoking that ordination.
So look, like everything about Joseph, like everything about early Mormon history, there's multiple accounts, right? And there are, and there's very little by way of an authoritative account of that ordination and what Joseph Smith may have known, thought, or felt. What we do know, we can say for sure, is that in the early church, there were Black people ordained. Elijah Abel was not the only one. Walker Lewis was also ordained. Right? There were a handful of folks, but they didn't necessarily have an easy go of it. And that at some point after the migration, the church and the territory became firmly arrayed against Black citizenship, Black freedom, and Black ordination. So if we read the contours of that history, I can't speculate on what Joseph knew and when he knew it, but I can tell you that imagine if someone came to your ward on Sunday and said, I was ordained in Brazil in the 1980s and I'm here and you need someone to bless the sacrament. Are you going to say, show me your papers? That's what happened to Elijah Abel all the time. Show me your papers. And then, someone else saying, no, I in fact know that all the ordinations in Brazil, they weren't legit. Imagine that scene in current day life. Like, why are we since when do we check people's papers on ordination? Like, what was that about? That was about a select network of powerful men who had a very particular view of what Utah should be.
Yeah. And at some point, this gets into the concept in the book that you call originalism, right? Which is that at some point this transitions into there was never any valid ordination of Black people whatsoever, right. And that this has always been God's law, and sort of there's nothing we can do about we can't tell God what to do, and that view seemed to persist officially for quite some time, and unofficially potentially for even much longer up until today. Yeah.
Right. And so this we see kind of consolidating in the first decade of the 20th century under the leadership of President Joseph F. Smith. And Joseph F. Smith had been in these circles forever. And he had on many occasions borne testimony to the ordination of Elijah Abel. He said, oh no, it was legit. I was there. Like, not he was there, but it was legit. He's been in our circles forever. He's one of us, right? He's one of us. Draw him in. He's also close friends with Jane Manning James. Jane Manning James dies in the spring of, I'm trying to remember, it was 1907 or 1908. And just a few months, and Joseph F. Smith speaks at her funeral. And just a few months later is when Joseph F. Smith changes his story. and in his role as LDS Church president, recants on the validity of Elijah Abel's ordination and says, "Oh no, it wasn't valid. Never was meant to be," despite his own witness. Why did he change his story? One of the last Black pioneers in the Salt Lake Valley who'd seen it herself was gone. Who was there to hold him accountable? What was all the pressure around him? The church had almost been bankrupted due to polygamy. It was trying to reconstruct itself in a way that it could survive and gain respectability. He made choices to make the priesthood sort of for white people, because how else would you convince, early priesthood correlation, how else would you structure those quorums and attract young white men in his mind, if you made them integrated spaces? There were not enough Black people to stand and demand it. And there were not enough white people who cared to create the space for Black people. And so it just kind of tilted that way. And between 1907-8 and 1949, it was 1949 when the first presidency finally put out a proclamation that said, of course, this is the policy of the church and it has been forever. That was under George Albert Smith. So during those 3 or 4 decades, it just gains steam and starts institutionalizing. But people are surprised. There are people on the record, like I highlight these letters between a sociology professor who's LDS named Lowry Nelson and the Brethren in the first presidency in the 1940s saying, wait a minute, since when is this our policy? Like, this is not cool. What are you doing? Whiteness is not real. Scientists know whiteness is a fake thing, and this is very disappointing. And they said, nope, this is the way it's always been.
Can we back up a little bit and talk about how we established this consensus around prophetic infallibility around the turn of the century? And
I know.
Let's like dig into that, because I feel like that is the snag still.
Oh yeah, it is, isn't it? So when do we start believing that prophets always get it right? Like once upon a time, Mormonism was a pretty small community, and the prophet, he could be kind of a jerk. You knew it. And sometimes he made mistakes, and there was just a lot of back and forth in humanity. People were on a first name basis. What we find is the church grows, and especially at the turn of the century, as it seeks to institutionalize, that the notion of the prophet as infallible comes into being. And we see it really in 1890, in the moment of the manifesto on polygamy. That's when, the church has fought itself to exhaustion against the federal government. Its finances are in ruin. And it knows it can no longer survive if it pursues polygamy publicly. And that's when the manifesto comes, right? Now, and the practice is eradicated, although the doctrine remains, right? And to hold together that impossible contradiction, that impossible turn of the corner, this is when we get the language around the Lord will never let the prophet lead the people astray. Because this is an impossible contradiction to manage. And that's when church leaders feel they absolutely have to have the trust and the faith of the people, like follow the prophet. Please. Yeah. I know it doesn't make sense. Just stay with me. This is how it's got to be. Wink, wink, nudge. And so the same thing, when we start backing ourselves into a corner on the ordination of Black people, despite our own history, despite living witnesses, just despite so much evidence, despite our own, best theology, that's when we see this appeal to infallibility. So when Lowry Nelson is challenging in the series of letters, George Albert Smith finally doubles down and says, you know what, this is how it's always been. This is how it will always be. Stop arguing with me. I'm the prophet, and we'll look at your membership if you don't quit. So that's where infallibility comes into play. It's like, how does modern Mormonism manage its contradictions? And it's through this notion of infallibility, or the prophet will never get it wrong, or even in a more daily form, there's got to be a good reason for that, right?
Yeah. And I think that's still what's so complicated is I think that members of the church now want to start with this. Obviously, God's not racist, but for so long we've been trained to believe, but the prophet speaks for God. And so then we get all of these ideas about, well, then why the priesthood ban? And I feel like those, even though that we've heard statements over and over in the last, couple of decades that none of these theories about why there was ever a ban have ever been legitimized. And I feel like they're really trying to shut those ideas down. It seems like people still feel some resistance to just saying it was wrong. It was just wrong. Like we still hold on to this idea that like, well, it was right for its time, or
We had to do it or else the church wouldn't have survived. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and so that's what I call it in the book, the possessive investment in rightness. And it's a take on a term from a scholar named George Lipsitz, who talks about the possessive investment in whiteness. So the identity whiteness is all about like forgetting where you actually come from. Like, you're not German, you're not Italian, you're white, and you should do white things, and you should vote for white candidates, and you should live in white neighborhoods and avoid black neighborhoods and not vote for black candidates. Right. So, and that has value, Lipsitz says, that has actual cash value. Like, we see it. There's like a tenfold difference in the average black and the average white person about intergenerational family wealth, right? A tenfold difference in family wealth, like not income equality may be closer at hand. Wealth is a huge gap due to centuries of policies about black economic development and excluding black people from being able to get mortgages because they lived in certain neighborhoods, like the whole thing, right? So by identifying with whiteness, you actually get something. You get help and immunity and resources. And so people want to keep it. That's that possessive investment. Same thing for Mormons. Our rightness is really important to us. It's really important to us. And again, the reason for that comes out of our fragility. It comes out of our historic sense of persecution. It comes out of our isolation. You know, like, you can say anything you want to about Cain and Ham and Egyptus, and it sounds just fine as long as everyone in the room is white. When you got to start saying that to African-American people, your tongue melts, right? You're just like, oh, never mind. Jesus, you know, like, ignore that. Just look at the Jesus part. Right. And so, but we feel so obliged to protect our past because we have a lot of shame. We've been made to feel ashamed for being Mormons.
Yeah.
And it's not worth the price though. We're ready. We're safe, right? Are we safe enough to turn the corner and say, we can still be beloved and be wrong? I think we are.
It takes a lot of courage, though, especially. I mean, and I would say less so today potentially, but in the 40s. I mean, and Lowry Nelson is such an amazing example. I would love for you to share, because you have this idea that it didn't have to be this way. You know, you bring up several heroes in the story who were remarkably just lucid for their time and seeing things sort of like outside of chronology almost.
And they were willing to wrestle. Like, they were willing to just be so uncomfortable and wrestle with it and not accept that the prophet did the wrestling. And so they just need to trust, and they have no responsibility.
Yeah, exactly.
One of the most powerful metaphors in the book is the edge of the herd metaphor. I don't know if you'd mind sharing that, and maybe just a couple quick stories about who these people were. Sure.
Well, so there's a whole generation of really fabulous, interesting white Mormon people in the early decades of the 20th century. And they, that's when a lot of LDS people started out migrating. And some folks, like my grandma's family, out migrated because of economic needs and reasons. And others went outside of the Utah-Idaho corridor for education. And we have this generation in the 30s and 40s who are going and getting their Ph.D.s, and they're seeking knowledge, and they're doing all the good stuff, and they become professors. And there's this whole network of historians and professors and sociologists who are LDS, who are faithful, but who have a scholarly or academic view of the world. And, just like so many people of faith, wrestling to reconcile those and finding lots of reasons to hold the church to core ethical values that we would associate with the essence of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So one of those people is Lowry Nelson, and he was a professor of sociology at the University of Minnesota, and he had been an expert. He had studied in Cuba. He'd written a book about Cuba. He was like an agricultural, he did sociology of agricultural villages, right? That was his thing. And he studied Cuba. And so in 1947, the president of the Church of Southern States Mission, who knew him from growing up back in Farron, Utah, writes him and says, hey, Lowry, you're an expert. So tell me, are there any pure white people in Cuba? Because we were thinking about starting a mission in Cuba. So are there any pure white people there? And Lowry's like, hold up, what do you mean? Are there any pure white people? So first of all, why would that matter? Second of all, there is no such thing as whiteness. It's a construct, and there's no way to determine pure anything. Like, what are you talking about? The gospel would be amazing for the people of Cuba. Please do not tell me that this is a policy that you're not going to go in unless you can find pure white people to hold the priesthood. And he has a back and forth with the Southern States Mission president, and then escalates it to George Albert Smith and the first presidency. and, has a really amazing exchange. And I posted it. It's on the web if you want to find it. It's also in my book, between Nelson and the first presidency, in which he really says to the first presidency, please tell me this is not going to become a policy, an official policy. This is very damaging. And they write back very sharply, and he just doesn't give up because, he's an old timer. He's like, what are they going to do? I'm from small town Utah. I know all of them. I've known them forever. I'm not afraid of them. I don't need to fall in line, and I won't forsake what I know is true to help make everyone comfortable around a racist policy. I will fight for what I love. And so the idea of being on the edge of the herd, right, that comes from the life of Juanita Brooks, who, mind you, these letters, I mean, these are typewritten. People make like copies of them somehow, and they're circulating around the American West, right? Like they're reading them, in libraries in Cedar City late at night, like, the little grassroots warm intellectuals in that hood, they're making their way to Stanford University. Like everybody, there's letters on file at the U of U from professors at BYU who are writing to Lowry Nelson saying, we're circulating your letter. We love it. Thank you so much. There's this whole underground, right? The people who would subscribe to Dialogue, for example, like those people are reading letters, like, and it's clinging to them. And, Juanita Brooks was one of those people. And she, of course, was an amazing grassroots Mormon historian who was not afraid of looking at the hard parts of being Mormon, not afraid of looking at, the dark side of our empire building experiment, looking at Mountain Meadows Massacre. And her father had said to her, I know you're one of this new generation of people who's getting an education, who's taking a hard look at things. You want to be the cowboy who doesn't ride in the middle of the herd. You don't want to leave the herd. What you want to do is you want to ride the edge of the herd. You want to ride the edge of the herd, and you can help shape the herd. You can help shape the boundaries of what it means to be telling the truth or not telling truth, to be in, to be out, by speaking your truth at the edge of the herd. To be respectful, to care about your people, but to be a little bit on the edge and be in a place of discomfort. And so that's the example of Lowry Nelson. It's the example of George Romney. Michigan Governor George Romney, Mitt's father, was very active in, supporting Black civil rights when he was governor of Michigan. He became Nixon's secretary for housing and urban development. He almost lost his job. Well, he did. He lost his job eventually, in part because he had upset Nixon by advocating for desegregation in federal housing projects. We know this. There have been Mormons all the way along who have thought otherwise and who have done brave things. And Apostle Delbert Stapley wrote to Romney and chastised him for marching with Black people in Grosse Pointe, Michigan. And, and Romney was just like, thank you, and put it aside and kept doing what he knew he had to do. And that's why I wasn't surprised when Mitt showed up at the Black Lives Matter.
That was pretty cool.
Yeah,
I was like, absolutely. He knows who his father was. I've been waiting for this Mitt. Very glad to see he's finally found his inner Mitt, because that's the Mitt I am totally rooting for. Right?
Yeah. So I feel like that kind of brings us to this giant question, which is, how do we dismantle systemic racism? Where do we start? What do we do now? Like, is this about getting Abraham Smoot's name off of BYU's administration building? Is it about writing a Facebook post? Literally, what can we do?
All of us want a list, right? Because we're Mormons and we know how to do down the list, and we want a manual and we want a schedule, and we're going to show up. And that's one of the things I really love about Mormon people, is because when we put our minds to something, we are all in, we're going to show up. So one thing I want to share is that I've been thinking about and wrestling with this since I was about 18 or 19 years old. And I've made it a focus of my life's work. I've been studying race and religion for 25 years. So first of all, get ready to settle in for the long haul. Make a promise to yourself that you're not going to let this moment pass without being a part of it in a good way. And it has to start with deep personal understanding. But it's not hard to come by, because there are so many people who have written essential books that will, and not just about Mormonism, about the way the U.S. works, that will help you understand. So, Mersha Bardaran is LDS. She was a law professor at BYU. Now she's at UCI. She's written an amazing book called The Color of Money that everyone should read, published by Harvard University Press, about inequality in banking and finance. everybody should read this book. Everyone should read The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, which is now a classic. Again, nothing to do with Mormonism, but talks about the mass incarceration of Black people in the United States during the 1980s and 1990s. We have 5% of the world's population and about 25% of its prison population here in the US. And so that book, read that book, watch 13 on Netflix. We're so lucky to live in an era where we have documentaries in our houses that they would have never come to the theater in LA, let alone Utah. But you can go right tonight with your spouse, put your kids to bed, or if they're over 12, make them watch it with you, because Black children aren't protected from this story. Black children aren't protected from the fact that this world is going to kill them, right? Why should our kids be protected from the fact that the world we benefit from kills Black people, Black children, like Tamir Rice, right? So you can watch 13th. You can watch When They See Us. There's so much. So just commit yourself. Commit yourself to reading for a year, maybe for a year, everything you can get your hands on, whatever Amazon suggests. Once you buy the new Jim Crow, get the next one, and just be a voracious learner. And find that humility and understanding in yourself. And you don't have to go carrying a banner into your Sunday meetings. We all need to study and understand the extent of this. And then when you're ready, look around where you are. Where's the struggle where you are? You don't have to make it a struggle at church. You just have to show up for the struggle as a Mormon person. Follow Black leadership. So there's a Black Lives Matter chapter in Salt Lake City. They probably have things they want help getting done. Do you know the stats on police brutality in Orem? Do you know the stats on police brutality in Salt Lake City? Is the chokehold allowed in Utah? Where is it allowed? There are 8 essential reforms that a group called Campaign Zero, founded by one of the leaders of Black Lives Matter, DeRay McKesson, is calling for. Are those 8 essential reforms going to happen in Utah, right? So there are people who are extremely knowledgeable at policy and have extraordinarily well-formulated asks for action. So be a good citizen, right? So read, and then listen to Black people and do what they say and show up with your body and show up with your money. It doesn't hurt. Like, can you toss some money to the bail fund? Can you toss some money to good charities in Utah that advance the well-being of children of color? And again, you don't have to fight on Sunday in church. Just show up for the fight as a Mormon person, and you'll help move yourself and our whole community to a different place. Yeah, I love that. And I think there's that individual side of it, but if we kind of go back to the beginning, there's also a very collective side of it. And I wonder if you could paint a vision for what the church itself, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as an anti-racist institution, what could that look like? What kind of impact could the church itself have? Ooh, well, so I'm not in the position to tell the church anything, clearly. I will say that I think the church is extraordinarily well positioned to affect enormous change for the good. I mean, so many good people have given their lives to build the kingdom, and the kingdom, we are well established and we are safe. And if we choose to turn even part of our substantial resources and attention to ensuring that Black people are not killed in the United States by police officers or by the state, or that Black children don't go hungry, or that Black women don't die at extraordinarily disproportionate numbers in childbirth, which is a fact, regardless of education and economic status. If we turned a corner of our attention to it, there would be a huge impact. So I will say too, though, that in terms of the deeper work of repentance and thinking about it, what we need to do, there are very committed Black LDS people who've been asking things of us for a long time. So it would be good to start listening. So there's a young woman named Melody Jackson who, went to BYU, and she was just covered in an article. I just posted it to one of my threads this morning, but she is among the Black LDS leaders who are calling for the church to, institute sort of anti-racist curriculum in some of its manuals. So they have asks. So dial into what they're asking and they're leading, because we have some amazing Black LDS people who have stuck with us for a long time beyond all reason. And they know what needs to be done, and we need to follow them. Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much, Joanna. I know in the book, Mormonism and White Supremacy, is there any other work you'd like to point listeners to, social media that you do, anything? Go read a lot of books by Black people. Oh, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Between the World and Me.
Oh, yeah.
That one is beautiful. And it's written to his son. And, one of the things I love about Mormonism is we take our children and the rearing of our children very, very seriously. Imagine what it would be like to be raising a Black child as a Black man and not be able to say to them, you're safe, and have to tell them all the time, you need to act this way so that you're not killed. And to begin to understand that is a wonderful place to start. So I don't want to point to my own stuff. Thank you. You've pointed to it. Go read books by Black people.
Okay. All right.
Thank you so much.
All
right. Thank you guys for the time.
Really appreciate you.
Thank you for your openness of heart, really, and for this opportunity. And just like, may our words bear good fruit. This is an important time. Like, don't let it go. Please don't let it go.
Thanks everyone for listening, and we hope that you got as much out of this conversation as we did. A huge thanks to Joanna for the work she's done on this book and for coming on to discuss it. Please check out the description for links to the books and other resources that Joanna recommended. Thanks for listening, and as always, you can check out more at faithmatters.org.